Hello, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me okay. We're going to start this afternoon's webinar. Thank you for all joining. The title of today's webinar is Redesigning and Redefining Tourism, and we're looking at what's happening in New Zealand. I'm Olivia Broadhurst, and I'm the coordinator of the Whitsunday Climate Change Innovation Hub. The Hub is an initiative of Whitsunday Regional Council and looks to build the resilience of the Whitsundays community and communities everywhere to climate change. We are very lucky at the Hub to be guided by a panel of experts, including Professor Susanne Becken. Susanne is a professor in sustainable tourism at Griffith University and is currently working for the New Zealand government and living in New Zealand. She is incredibly well published with over 100 articles on sustainable tourism. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has come as a huge shock to global tourism. Businesses and destinations have been forced to reinvent their offering and look at targeting different markets. Some of the impacts we are witnessing could be considered as an accelerated scenario of how the climate crisis and other macro challenges might affect tourism. Today, Susanne is going to share with us the approach that the New Zealand government is taking by focusing on this as an opportunity to redefine tourism so that it is not only more sustainable, but more resilient and delivers net benefits to destinations. Susanne is going to provide approximately a 20-minute presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions. You can also type questions in the chat, and please use the raising hand function if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, we do ask if you could please keep your microphone on mute throughout the presentation. We are recording the webinar and we are going to share a link with you afterwards. If you also wouldn't mind turning off your video, that will probably help with the quality of the call as well. So I will turn the presentation over now to Susanne Becken.
Thank you, Olivia, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to kind of virtually join you guys in Queensland and see the lovely background in Olivia's picture. Makes me a bit homesick to come back. So I'm trying to share my screen, and all going well. If I don't hear anything otherwise, I assume it's working, Olivia. Yes, I assume it's working. So what I'm doing is I will literally focus on New Zealand, but my very last slide will then transition to what does this mean for the Whitsundays. And I know that many of you who are on the call actually really know Queensland tourism very well and the Great Barrier Reef. So I'm really hoping that we get a good discussion that we all find useful in thinking forward how to get out of this crisis in the best way possible. So the official term in New Zealand is actually reimagining. I didn't want to overuse that, so I called the presentation Redesigning and Redefining. And I might start just sort of to remind ourselves really briefly back in time, because it's not been that long. In fact, even still in January this year, that it was sort of the land of plenty with tourism growing to the extent that, as it turns out now, many tourism operators in some ways failed to innovate, to work on their product, because just like in Australia, the growth rates in New Zealand were about 8, 9, 10% every year. So operators really didn't have to do much to essentially sell their offerings. And so now it turns out that there's actually a lot of issues. The image of the airport I put in to also remind ourselves how tourism has become a machine that potentially does not deliver anymore on the basic needs why people travel. And we can go into that later, but there's again an opportunity to maybe redefine or remember what travel was about and what kind of we have turned it into. It has led to a whole lot of issues, and I will really sort of run through those. They all relate to some form of caring capacity, whether it's sort of social community based or whether it's environmental. And the left photo here is, for those people who know New Zealand, is Aoraki, Mount Cook. And the camper vans, of which it seems there's just far too many, they're all parked up now or rented out to domestic visitors at very, very cheap rates. But there's obviously been an excessive sort of expansion into that type of travel. The other one is a famous example that most of you would know from Thailand. often it has actually sort of, rather than maybe environmental capacities, it has exceeded social, so the visitor experience capacity, and this is a very famous peak that has made it on Instagram, and nobody knew it before, to be honest. It's just above Lake Wanaka, and you stand there, you have to walk up for 3 hours, and then you get your shot. And there was a newspaper article that showed the real picture where you literally have to queue for that amazing shot. So this is where it's in some ways really got out of hand. Because of that, the New Zealand Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, who's some kind of environmental audit office, Simon Upton, and he's got a whole team, they undertook an inquiry into tourism, and it came out just before Christmas, so essentially a year ago. And they looked at, well, basically the environmental impacts of the current volume and the projected, which of course now in the moment is not happening, but essentially they concluded growth has been completely unmanaged. There's very high density in some places. There's this loss of natural quiet for which New Zealand is really known, like the solitude and the tranquility in the natural environment that is lost in many places. Including from helicopter noise, a very high carbon footprint. So they did some calculations due to air travel and cruise ships. High impact of freedom camping. So that's people like those camper van people I showed who literally drive around and stay wherever they want and cause a lot of impact, including human waste, low pay, very transient workforce, a bit like Australia as well. Degradation of landscapes, and in some ways, interestingly, a conflict between what central government wants and what local communities want, including the Maori in certain regions who might say, well, we don't want any investment here, and central government comes in and builds a new route. Why? Because tourism has really been seen as this growth engine for government revenue, for taxes. So that's a good picture. So just for context, this is Christmas, and then comes COVID. But just really briefly, and it'd be really interesting to see how those diagnostics would stack up in Australia. They might be a bit similar. So what I did recently was to look at the arrivals, which have gone upwards. But then I looked at the spending per person. So this is some kind of metric that you can derive then spending per arrival, which has been stagnant. I did look at sort of what would it even have to be if we were to adjust it for inflation. And so you can see just for 2009, it would have to be $5,000 per head. So one might argue that we've actually gone backwards. So we're selling the natural environment and maybe community goodwill for ever decreasing margins of return. And this is the jobs per 1,000 arrivals. So there's fewer jobs because I guess labor productivity is to be increased. And then the value add per dollar spent has been stagnant for the last sort of 15 years. So you have to ask yourself, why on earth was it planned to go from currently 4 million to 5 million visitors? And the projections were up to 10 million. So why would you do that? Okay. A whole new chapter. As you can imagine, the previous report was quite geared towards, okay, what do we do? Now we have the opposite problem. No arrivals whatsoever. A sharp drop in international flights, except really for flights that bring New Zealanders back home, and more recently those people who were fishermen from the Ukraine and absolutely essential workers for Sea Lord, one of the big fishing companies. And of course, as you might have seen in the media or not, out of those fishermen, of course, many tested positive, and that is a big problem anyway. So essentially borders are closed, and we now think it might be, apart from hopefully coming to the Whitsundays, Olivia, we might be stuck for quite some time. What's really important though is that because we have sort of, I guess, more or less eliminated the virus, with the exception of the odd little flare up, we are almost back to, so domestic travel is 80% of what it was. and that's by international comparison pretty good. Here's some June figures, and it has actually improved since then. I don't have pictures now, but so what it tells us is that some parts of tourism are not suffering as badly as one might have thought. Of course, airlines, but other parts that do not necessarily rely on international visitors, especially since obviously there's a lot of domestic tourism now and people traveling quite profusely, actually, to the extent that it's impossible to get anything, any accommodation anywhere on the weekend. So Olivia mentioned I do work for the Department of Conservation, and it's a bit like Bournemouth in the UK or the Bavarian Lakes in Germany, where all of a sudden those spots where in summer a few people go, you have thousands of people lining up, and so it's a little bit like that, and we are facing a very strong demand. This is a map with what we call the Great Walks, and you can see all the Great Walks are up in the booking compared with the previous year. So the domestic is not only compensating, but it's exceeding what would have been there if they had been international. The only ones that are down, the Milford and the Woodburn, are the ones that got wiped out last year. Actually, was this year, was just before COVID in January, with some major storm events. So that's why they are down. But essentially, they're up. What operators find, some have never been busier. Others now who offer, of course, product that is very specialized towards international, so indigenous, so Maori cultural activities, couch tours, obviously travel agents, inbound tour operators, all of that, but also certain types of activities that just don't go so well with the domestic demand. Others completely overbooked. And this notion, and I heard the same, funnily enough, this 3 hours driving time seems to be an international sort of limit of where people go outside their population center. So it's quite peaky, and it throws up completely new management challenges, at least for the summer to come. But it also has actually, it has triggered a thinking, to what extent do we need international tourism? What are actually the benefits of domestic? Domestic ever only just happened. There was never any marketing. There was never any product development. There was, in fact, we don't even have data on domestic travel. We stopped collecting any data in 2012. So we know very little, except now that it's all we have. So there's a shift in thinking. Now, because there has already been quite a drive towards, I guess, sustainable tourism, and maybe because it started to become quite painful before COVID, there has now been a massive shift towards, in some ways, almost everyone singing from the same song sheet that we need to completely transform tourism. So the government established a tourism future task force. In fact, it's actually a tourism futures task force, because there's many different futures, and we want to explore the futures and which ones are best for New Zealand. It's a public-private partnership, so it consists of a very small number of very high-profile people, and then a larger advisory group of industry leaders and a few experts. I'm on the advisory group, and so we have meetings with the task force, who then will put recommendations to a set of ministers. And it's really, the mandate is, you're not a recovery task force, you're a futures task force. So don't worry about, wage subsidies and immediate help. This is not the purpose. The purpose is to think ahead and really redesign the whole way we do tourism. Okay, so the first report will be due in December, and then the final report in April. The way the task force is approaching that on purpose, and because they are sort of longer term oriented, is to jump. So if you look at the letter A, it's really about developing the vision. So what do we want for tourism in New Zealand to do? And it really links very closely into the well-being framework that the government has more broadly, and the 4 capitals. So tourism contributing to, yes, economic, but there seems to be an agreement that all we have done is focus on the economics, and we've forgotten the social, the human, and the environmental capital. And so this future needs to be balanced across all those. And if it means a lesser economic return, but a environmental restoration benefit, then that is the right decision. So from the vision, you then backcast, and I guess we're in this process now of coming up with solutions and finding out what are the best levers that the government could implement. Just to give you one flavor, this is from an earlier input that Tourism New Zealand provided, but it shows you the idea of, so first of all, very strong input from Maori ideology and worldview. So the idea of humans and nature essentially being really one. So do not separate them. If it's not good for the environment, it cannot be good for us. So that's one. It's all about, so the kaitiakitanga is looking after the place, the stewardship. The manakitanga is the hospitality. And then you've got place, people, and experiences. But it is anchored in the Maori worldview. Okay, so in the moment, it looks like it will be structured around 5 or 6 change themes. And so I did not put them here because they are evolving, and I don't know if it's a state secret or not, but the idea is to identify, so one change theme is around the environment. And so there it's really clear that tourism needs to become carbon neutral or basically zero carbon. And you can debate what that means in terms of offsetting and net zero as opposed to zero, but there's a clear recognition that by 2050, essentially tourism must have decarbonized. Tourism needs to contribute to restoration of the natural environment and biodiversity. So that's one change theme. Another one is around the structure of the industry. So for example, the relationship between the federal or central government and the local government. And there's a general feeling that power and funds need to be redistributed down towards the local level to enable the communities to actually manage their tourism, rather than in our last meeting we discussed this notion that communities often feel that tourism is done to them, so they're kind of disempowered victims of external forces. So, and there's maybe sometimes that's perceptions and sometimes it's true, and it's the structures and also the way the money flows, and so it goes on. So there's a community theme, and it may be that there will be one around research and data and innovation. Okay, so some of you may have seen us by Anna Pollock and or other sort of Diane Dredge who talk about regenerative tourism, and so that's really at the core of this whole reimagining, I guess, effort or journey, is from tourism being exploitative, and so in the bottom you see a degenerating system, so tourism taking to extract essentially economic benefit and maybe visitor experiences for some, to moving towards a state that one might call then sustainable, to just sustain a steady sort of status quo, to then moving towards a regenerative approach that actively ensures that tourism, I guess the shorthand is leaves behind more than it takes. Now, what does that mean in practice? That obviously is to be learned and discovered, but at least as a goal. So, for example, tourists and Olivia, we talked about coral restoration projects where the tourism industry could have a net positive effect, whether it's for the visitors, the community, or the operators, or a partnership. So moving towards restoring and regenerating, and that's both the environment but also the culture. So this idea of flourishing and healing past damage is also really important in those discussions. The notion of planetary boundaries is really important, and I mentioned climate change. So there will be a crunch point in all those discussions. Ultimately, the volume question and how much tourism or how much tourism impact can we actually tolerate in a particular place. So that will at some point, at some point there will be some hard decisions, I guess. And then the whole concept of the donut economics, where you want to, so in the middle you have this space of tourism delivering enough dividend, for example, for social well-being, but also then at the outer end being constrained by the ecological imperatives. And so there's a nice Mari donut. There's actually different versions of it, but again, it just shows you that importance of linking it to the frameworks and understandings of Maridom. Now, just today I got this, actually someone sent me and said, oh, you need to check the Labour election manifesto, because obviously we now have Labour in government with an absolute majority, and I guess people do expect that a lot will happen in the next 3 years. And so there's 3 particular points where tourism is mentioned. And you will see right up there, just highlighted in red, because it's a bit text heavy. So restart, reimagine, you get that, then the sustainable, low carbon, high skill, high wage, high value. So it sounds a bit like a wish list, but I guess that is kind of the vision. It does recognize the importance of domestic tourism. And then again, it's quite interesting, the last point where it says our natural environment is critical to our well-being. So again, the central importance of well-being, tourism and national identity. And the just in response to COVID, the government has already invested in nature. And so I'll just show you this one, because it's one of the biggest stimulus packages of the government, 1.2 billion into jobs for nature. And there's different types. There's wetland restoration, there's reforestation, there's working with farmers to increase biodiversity on farms. So there's a whole bunch. Some are specifically in areas where there's tourism unemployment. So for example, there's a project with A.J. Hackett Bungie in Queenstown to restore the vegetation in one of the areas where they operate. So that's good, and hopefully building a closer link between tourism and conservation. I'll just give a few other examples just to stimulate some ideas, and then I will conclude and look forward to how we can, so what's happening in the Whitsundays and how we can maybe think what it means. There's a real, as I indicated earlier, there's a real appetite for becoming a little bit more place-based, so local, not national. And there's a drive from the communities and the regional tourism organizations to really invest, and they actually have received. Can you still hear me, Olivia? Oh, good. The government actually has also provided specific stimulus money for RTOs, and one condition was to actually invest that into destination management, including in particular sustainability. So what I'm showing here is the tourism plan of the Bay of Plenty. And again, you can see the terms environmental regeneration, community inclusivity, transformational visitor experiences, and the DNA that is unique to the Whakapapa. So it's all about regeneration. It's all about place building by the locals, so that they are in a good position to welcome the visitors that they want to welcome. So that's the idea of it, and that's the Tourism Industry Association has, sort of before COVID, already started with their New Zealand Tourism Sustainability Commitment, and that has particular areas: economic, visitor, community, environment. What's important is that obviously before it was voluntary, and now there's a bit a move towards, can we make it mandatory, and how can you strengthen it towards measurement and really stepping it up industry-wide as a program. And the last example, just to highlight this sort of interest from local level to ensure that tourism is not just something that passes through, but something that has a purpose and actually leaves the community in a better state than it was before. So Kiwi Welcome is based in the Queenstown area, and you can become part of that to essentially buy. It's a bit like Flybys. You subscribe to it and you get discounts, but the money goes towards local initiatives, whether they are social or environmental. So you can see local community. So it's really connecting around a common purpose. it's just been launched, so we don't know yet how it goes. Okay, my last slide, what would regenerative tourism look like in the Whitsunday Islands? And I think really important that obviously there's already a lot happening, so it's not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but it's connecting it, thinking systemic and maybe scaling up. So for example, what are the linkages between tourism and other industries? Can that strengthen the economic benefit, but maybe also sustainability partnerships? What restoration activities are happening? Now there's quite a bit of stuff happening. What kind of visitors would be the right visitors? What kind of measurement is already been done or should be done? How much is the community involved in driving the vision and determining what's happening? And how can risks be managed? That's climate risk, but also maybe over dependencies on particular markets. So I think this is the time to really think about those types of issues. So to conclude and maybe start the discussion, and I'm sure you've thought a lot about it already anyway, but one thing is to consider what's actually already, what is working. So there's no need, I mean, transformation doesn't mean to throw everything out, but to say, okay, we've actually a few things that are really, really good, but which ones are the things that we want to leave behind? And that always has to happen when you sort of merge into a new system. So what do we need to preserve and, or little typo, and which ones to abandon? What mechanisms need to be put in place to move into the right trajectory? So for example, funding models, is there enough funding to do the things that need to be done? So we already have a tour nationally, but there's discussion of a local bed tax to really provide funds for local government. What other regulation, like mandatory carbon reporting, for example, education campaigns, etc. So what are the levers and who is putting them in place? So I think with that, Olivia, I leave it. Let me see if I lost you altogether. Hopefully not. Here we are. All right, so really keen to hear what people think and what's already happening.
Do we have any questions from anyone online? You can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and start talking. It's fine. Okay, well, I might have a question. Oh, Sharon, did you want to?
I just want to know how we get these people over here, and because this is honestly everything that's just been said and all the slides I've just looked for. I can't tell you how many meetings we've sat in asking for all of these things. Like at the moment, we're asking the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority for a lot of the things that have just been outlined. And I just think we need to get this New Zealand model in front of every single, we need to get it in front of us and federal governments. And I mean, obviously it is in front of our council, Olivia, but this is, I mean, Ryan, the mayor, need to be seeing this presentation, and this is what our tourism industry is asking for, what we've been looking out for years, not even, you know, this is prior to COVID, and we need it even more now. Yeah.
It is true that in the moment, luckily, and fingers crossed, the environment is really good in New Zealand, as in, I mean, the political environment, I mean, and the frame and where the political will, I guess. And look, I'm sure there will be lots of obstacles as well, and always the risk to slip back into business as usual. But I think if we can't make significant changes now, then we probably never can. So that's true. On the other hand, that example of the Bay of Islands, which really also started before COVID, there's a lot that can be done by a destination on their own. I mean, now, of course, they get real tailwind. I mean, and they're so advanced, they can actually grab some of these, you know, ideas in the fertile soil, and so that's really great. But they have started the journey before. So that's one thing. I don't know if there's opportunity for alliances between some destinations to strengthen the voice. So I think there's hopefully still opportunity to get a few things off the ground, even if maybe the overall environment doesn't quite have the levers in the right place.
Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, I've got a question. Dominic, did you have a question? Melinda, sorry. So I've got a question for you, Susanne. Obviously, you're doing the higher level planning at the moment, but I'm just wondering whether you've considered what kind of programs or systems or incentives may be applied to get all of the operators on board with these programs. Like, is New Zealand developing their own program or tapping into an existing program to help with that?
Yes, so there is the existing that sustainability commitment by the industry association. So there's the QTEC equivalent, and sort of it's got areas like carbon and what do you do for biodiversity and what do you do for minimum wage. So it's reasonably comprehensive, but one might accuse it of being a bit soft still. So it's not like EarthCheck that really measures and in some ways has those, I guess, benchmarks and you've got to perform. So it's more a commitment. It has 1,500 members or so now, and the argument always goes, okay, we get them all involved and raise awareness and they do stuff, but now the discussion is make it mandatory, phase in measurement. So you using an existing vehicle, but I think they might have even used the term of tightening the screws. So anyway, in a good way. That's one way. Another one would be, so in the Department of Conservation, where I work, we're exploring whether the concession that an operator gets to work in national parks should have conditions attached to the environmental performance, including in particular carbon reporting and a plan for carbon reduction. So there's some of those regulatory levers, and also how the government gives out money in the future. So that is another consideration to support destinations, only if they show certain things.
And is the tourism sector, like the goals for the tourism sector, going to align with the Paris Agreement, or have they set more optimistic targets?
So this is a really good question, Olivia, because there's actually a bit of a discussion in the moment, and one that's equally relevant to Australia, because technically, as you know, we're not really a sector. I mean, in the political framework, so there's national goals for carbon, and then it's broken down into a few sectors where there will be sector goals: transport, energy, agriculture. Can't remember 6, not tourism, because tourism is a bit of everything, and so there's a bit of a discussion in the moment, and a bit of initiative. Should tourism have their own goal, or are they just part of, the transport goal? Obviously, will really impact on Air New Zealand, for example, and the rental car fleets. So that will already be filtering down. But then, for example, what things that are really specific to tourism. So that's in discussion, and I don't know, there's no answer yet.
Okay, that's interesting. Watch that space.
Yeah, watch that space. I see a few other familiar faces here from Griffith.
Yeah.
Yep.
Does anybody else have any questions for Susanne?
Just around budget. What? So obviously you said that these recommendations, that the task force is coming up with recommendations which are going back to ministers, and was what sort of funding models would be needed. Has the New Zealand government come up with a budget that they're prepared to put behind this to make it happen?
Very good question, and I'm absolutely sure that the recommendations of the task force will definitely have a dollar figure attached, no doubt about that. But there's different, well, in fact, to elaborate a bit, there's actually even calls within this process now to even establish how much the government is already investing in tourism, because it's actually a lot by the time we've got a regional development fund. And if you were to take out tourism projects, and there's major, I mean, we're talking many 100, 200 million. There's Milford Sound redevelopment. There's a lot. There's marketing, obviously, which might have to, be revisited, because the amount was 150 million for international marketing. So there's a lot of money being spent. Is it spent in the right place? So that's one thing. The other one is the international visitor levy, which is $35 per person, just that nobody's coming now. So the idea was to get about 80 million a year for tourism and conservation in particular, but now it's dried out. And again, in some ways, you don't want to make yourself dependent on a mechanism when you actually say, well, maybe we don't need quite that much international travel. So you can't hang all your projects on it. And then there's the discussion of a bed tax, which would then go straight back to the local government to manage some of those infrastructure issues. And so whether then there's other, we sort of the academics are obviously trying to ask for some investment into research, into specific tourism science development to inform all this change process. And so there could be different pots of money. I guess once you have a vehicle, then it's easier to attach funds to it. So anyway, that's the hope.
And just another question about how you're going to, so it wasn't just the funding, obviously you were talking about the need to change some things from being voluntary to mandatory, and we've got similar sorts of issues here that will need to happen for the industry. But what we come up against there is, well, for a start, we've got political will that needs to be applied. But also, we then find we get into the realms of bureaucratic hurdles and legislation. How is your government getting around those, or what are you going to do?
I think a little bit what you said earlier, that in fact many destinations and tourism businesses do want the change. So there's a collective interest in not continuing with business as usual, because there was a recognition. That's why I started with the how, this is how it actually started to look quite bad, to the detriment of tourism. So there's an understanding that we don't want to continue as before, so we got to do something. And as long as everyone does it, even Air New Zealand says, if there will be a carbon tax on international flights, as long as it's on every carrier, we're actually happy with that. So there's, I think there's a reasonable willingness. The other one is that some things might be kind of mandatory by industry for industry. And that's maybe a little bit more accepted. And then obviously you need the support systems and the investment, so then you're back at funding. But it's a bit like the decarbonizing the Great Barrier Reef Island project, where I think quite a bit of Queensland government funding went into working with the resorts to help reduce, I guess, carbon impacts. So then it's a partnership approach with some incentive. I don't know, I'd be interested in, and also Olivia, because I know you've got a lot going. There's already, especially in the Whitsundays, I would say there's probably a lot of almost sort of seeds or catalyst projects and willingness and networks already. So it's not from scratch. I mean, there's a lot happening, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things that you've mentioned today, which, like Sharon said, would be very timely to implement now. And I can see how it would really give us that oversight over everything and help us to make sure that we're doing everything as sustainable and being proactive as New Zealand seems to be being. So, unless there's any other questions, I might wrap up the presentation. So, yep. Thank you very much, Susanne. I have found it incredibly insightful, so I'm sure that everybody else has. If anybody wants to provide feedback on the webinar, please do so by email. We're really interested to understand where you think this may go, how this may benefit yourselves, your organisations, what your take-home messages are. We are going to share the recording. The Climate Hub is working with council and industry through other projects as well on mitigating and adapting to climate change. And we do have our own website. So if you're interested in any more information about the Climate Hub, please go online and have a look at our website. And we're also on Facebook. We are going to be doing more webinars, so keep an eye out. We're going to hopefully have the next webinar of this series in January, featuring Dr. Joanna Lair from Griffith University of Tourism, Sport and Hotel Management. So thank you again, Susanne. I hope everyone's enjoyed the webinar, and we'll see you again shortly.
Thank you, Olivia, and
Thank you.
good evening, everyone. Bye.
Good night. Bye.